In the spring of 1865, the United States Army had a problem it had never encountered before. The problem was too many guns. The Union Army at the peak of the Civil War had fielded approximately 1 million men. Those men were equipped with rifles, pistols, carbines, and artillery pieces in quantities that had required an industrial mobilization without precedent in American history. By April of 1865, the war was over. The men were going home. The weapons were not. The federal government held at the conclusion of the Civil War an estimated 1,600,000 shoulder arms, 370,000 revolvers, and artillery and ordnance stores beyond anything the peacetime military could absorb or store. The question of what to do with all of it would shape the next 3 decades of American history in ways that the official accounts of the frontier West have never fully confronted. The guns went west. They went west through auction houses and government surplus sales, through informal trade networks that operated across the former Confederate states and across the Mississippi, through direct sale to civilian buyers who had been following the technology of the war with intense interest, and through the hands of veterans on both sides who brought their service weapons home, and then kept moving toward the territories where land was available and the rule of law was still being negotiated. What those weapons did when they arrived on the frontier, how they changed the balance of power between different groups, how they shaped the specific character of violence in the post-war West, and how the mythology that grew up around them was constructed and maintained, that is the investigation this documentary undertakes. Start with the weapons themselves, because the specific technology matters enormously for understanding what followed. The Civil War was not fought with a single type of weapon. It was fought with an overlapping array of technologies that ranged from single-shot muzzle-loading muskets that would not have been out of place in the American Revolution, to repeating rifles that could fire 15 rounds without reloading, and that represented the most advanced small arms technology anywhere on Earth in 1865. The men who fought with these weapons understood their capabilities and limitations, with the practical intimacy of people who had staked their lives on that understanding. When those men moved west, they brought that knowledge with them. The Springfield Model. 1863, the standard Union infantry rifle of the latter part of the war, was a percussion-cap muzzle loader firing a .58 caliber mini-ball. It was accurate to roughly 300 yards in the hands of a trained infantryman, reliable under field conditions, and available in enormous quantities at war's end. The federal government sold surplus Springfields through the Ordnance Department at prices that made them accessible to almost anyone with a few dollars. And a weapon that had been state-of-the-art in 1863 was already being superseded by breech loading and repeating technology by 1865, which meant the government was motivated to move the inventory quickly and buyers could acquire serious firepower at minimal cost. The economics of the surplus market produced one of the most rapid and dramatic armings of a civilian population in the history of any country. In the decade following the Civil War, the Great Plains and the territories west of the Mississippi became one of the most heavily armed civilian environments in the world. Not because the people living there were uniquely violent by nature, but because the economics of surplus military hardware made acquiring effective weapons cheaper than at any previous point in American history, and because the conditions of frontier life, the distance from law enforcement, the presence of conflict over land and resources, the absence of the social infrastructure that moderates violence in established communities, created strong incentives to be armed. The Spencer repeating carbine was perhaps the single most consequential military surplus weapon to reach the frontier. The Spencer was a lever-action repeating firearm that fired a copper-cased rimfire cartridge from a 7-round tubular magazine housed in the buttstock. A trained user could fire 14 aimed rounds per minute, loading a fresh magazine in a matter of seconds. The Spencer had been the primary weapon of Union cavalry during the latter part of the war. Union cavalry troopers had demonstrated at engagements including Gettysburg and Yellow Tavern what a repeating firearm could do in a mounted fight against opponents armed with single-shot weapons. Confederate soldiers captured in engagements where Union cavalry carried Spencers described the experience of facing the weapon as unlike anything in their prior military experience. After the war, Spencers entered the surplus market in large numbers. They were purchased by hunters, ranchers, freight operators, and anyone else moving through territory where armed conflict was a realistic possibility. They were also purchased by Native American warriors who understood the weapon's advantages with the same clarity that Union cavalry had demonstrated them. The presence of Spencer carbines in the hands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and other Plains nations by the late 1860s represented a significant shift in the military balance on the northern plains, one that the Army had inadvertently facilitated through its own surplus sales policies. The Henry rifle, the 16-round lever-action repeater that preceded the Winchester Model 1866, was available in smaller numbers from the surplus market because it had been purchased primarily through private commercial channels during the war rather than through military contracts. But its presence on the frontier was significant because it represented the ceiling of repeating rifle technology available to civilians in the immediate post-war period. A man with a Henry rifle in 1867 was carrying approximately 3 times the effective firepower of a man with a single-shot breech-loader and roughly 14 times the firepower of a man with a muzzle-loading musket. The Henry was expensive enough that it was not universally accessible, but it was available, and the men who owned them knew exactly what they had. The Colt Army Model 1860, the standard Union cavalry revolver of the war, was the handgun most directly associated with the post-war frontier. It was a cap-and-ball percussion revolver chambered in .44 caliber, capable of 6 shots before reloading, and it had been produced in quantities of around 200,000 during the war years alone. The surplus market in Colt revolvers after 1865 was enormous, and the price of a used Colt Army dropped to levels that made it accessible to working-class buyers who could not have afforded the weapon at its pre-war price. The Colt revolver and the mythology of the West are inseparable in the popular imagination, and it is worth examining how that relationship actually developed because the reality is considerably more complicated than the mythology suggests. The revolver was not the primary weapon of frontier violence. The rifle and the shotgun were far more commonly used in the actual incidents that gave the post-war West its violent reputation. The revolver was a secondary weapon, carried for close-range defense or for situations where a long arm was impractical. The men who became famous as pistol fighters were exceptions, and their fame was partly a product of the newspaper culture that amplified certain stories about frontier violence in ways that systematically distorted the statistical reality. But the exception is important for understanding what happened when Civil War weapons met frontier conditions, because the men who became genuinely skilled with the revolver had almost invariably developed that skill in the context of the Civil War or its immediate aftermath. James Butler Hickok, known as Wild Bill, had served as a scout and spy for the Union Army and had been involved in multiple armed confrontations before the war ended. His reputation as a pistol fighter was built on encounters that occurred after the war, but the skills he brought to those encounters were shaped by wartime experience and by access to military surplus weapons that gave him practical familiarity with the Colt revolver that most frontier civilians did not share. The Colt Single-Action Army Revolver, introduced in 1873 and quickly adopted by the Army as its standard sidearm, was the weapon that most completely embodied the synthesis of Civil War technology development and frontier demand. It was chambered for the .45 Colt centerfire cartridge, a metallic cartridge that replaced the cap-and-ball system of the war-era revolvers with a self-contained round that was faster to load, more reliable in field conditions, and less susceptible to the weather problems that had plagued percussion revolvers in wet or cold conditions. The single-action Army was mechanically derived from the wartime Colt revolvers, refined through the experience of thousands of users and the commercial incentives of a market that understood exactly what it needed from a handgun. The Army contracted for over 37,000 single-action Army revolvers in its first production run. Civilian sales ran for decades. The Winchester Model 1873, the rifle that advertising eventually called the gun that won the West, was chambered in the same .44-40 caliber as the Colt Frontier Model revolver, a deliberate commercial decision by the manufacturers that allowed a man to carry a single supply of ammunition for both his rifle and his revolver. This interchangeability, which had no direct military precedent but reflected a practical understanding of frontier logistics, was a significant selling point in territories where ammunition supply could be uncertain and where the difference between having compatible cartridges and not could be a matter of survival. The relationship between surplus Civil War weapons and the specific shape of frontier violence is most clearly visible in the conflicts between the Army and the Plains nations during the period from 1865 to 1890. This is a subject that the popular mythology of the West handles badly, and that the historical record handles with considerably more complexity and moral ambiguity than the mythology allows for. The Plains nations had been acquiring firearms through trade for decades before the Civil War. By 1865, the most warriors on the Great Plains were armed with some combination of firearms and traditional weapons, and the quality of their firearms varied enormously depending on what the trade networks had made available. The flood of military surplus weapons after 1865 changed this picture significantly because the surplus market made available not just low-quality trade guns, but actual military-grade weapons, including Spencer carbines, breech-loading Springfield conversions, and eventually Sharps and Remington rifles, that were equivalent to, or in some respects superior to, what the Army itself was carrying. The engagement at the Fetterman Fight in December of 1866, in which a column of 81 soldiers under Captain William Fetterman was destroyed by a Lakota and Cheyenne force in the Powder River country of present-day Wyoming, took place in a context where the warriors involved were armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and firearms that included some of the same surplus weapons flooding the civilian market. The Army's investigation of the engagement noted the effectiveness of the opposing forces' weaponry without drawing the obvious inference about where that weaponry had come from. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in June of 1876 is the most famous engagement of the Plains Wars, and it is the engagement where the intersection of Civil War surplus weapons, post-war commercial weapons development, and frontier conflict is most clearly documented. How the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Custer carried single-shot Springfield carbines and Colt single-action Army revolvers. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors they encountered carried a mixture of weapons that included significant numbers of Winchester Model 1873 repeating rifles. Archaeological investigation of the battlefield conducted in the 1980s, following a fire that exposed previously buried artifacts, recovered over 4,000 cartridge cases and bullets from the site. Analysis of the ballistic evidence established that the opposing force was armed with Winchester repeating rifles in numbers that gave them a significant firepower advantage over the single-shot carbines of the 7th Cavalry. The Army's own weapons choices are part of this story in a way that has received insufficient attention. The Ordnance Department had evaluated repeating rifles for cavalry service after the Civil War and had specifically chosen the single-shot Springfield carbine over repeating alternatives on grounds of ammunition economy. The reasoning was that repeating rifles encouraged soldiers to fire too rapidly, wasting ammunition, whereas the deliberate pace of single-shot fire encouraged accuracy. This reasoning was not entirely without merit as an abstract, ballistic argument. As a practical judgment about the conditions of cavalry combat against opponents, armed with repeating rifles in terrain that favored ambush and rapid movement, it proved to be catastrophic. The gunfighters whose names became synonymous with the violent reputation of the post-war West were, without exception, products of the Civil War's weapons culture. Doc Holliday carried a nickel-plated Colt and a shotgun, weapons that represented the top of the commercial firearms market of his period, and his reputation for effectiveness with them was built on a combination of natural aptitude and the practical firearms culture of a generation shaped by the war. Holliday had been born in Georgia in 1851 and had grown up in a household shaped by the Confederate experience of the war. The weapons culture he absorbed was the culture of a defeated society that retained its practical relationship with firearms long after the conflict that had defined it. Wyatt Earp's use of a long-barreled Colt, what he called his buntline special, was part of a tactical philosophy about handgun fighting that reflected the wartime understanding that a longer barrel improved accuracy at the ranges where frontier encounters typically occurred. Earp had been too young to serve in the Civil War, born in 1848, but 3 of his brothers had served and the family had spent the war years in a Missouri that was as thoroughly militarized as any place in America. The firearms culture of the Earp family was the culture of men who had grown up watching war happen and who had absorbed its practical lessons without the formal military training that shaped the generation immediately before them. Bass Reeves, the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi and by many accounts the most effective lawman of the frontier era, he carried a pair of Colt revolvers and was reportedly ambidextrous with both. Reeves had been enslaved before the war and had escaped during it, living among the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory until emancipation. His practical experience with weapons was developed in conditions considerably more dangerous than anything the white lawmen of his era faced, and his record of 75 outlaws apprehended, and an undefeated record in gunfights was built entirely on the weapons technology of the post-war commercial market. Reeves's story is one that the mythology of the Western gunfighter has been slow to incorporate, for reasons that have more to do with the racial assumptions embedded in that mythology than with any deficiency in the historical record. The gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, in October of 1881, lasted approximately 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, roughly 30 shots were fired. The weapons involved included Colt single-action Army revolvers, a Wells Fargo shotgun, and possibly a Winchester rifle. The encounter has been reconstructed in detail by historians, and the reconstruction reveals something that the mythology glosses over. The fight was determined less by individual skill with a pistol than by positioning, surprise, and the decision about when to draw. The weapons were so capable and the distances involved were so short that the outcome was largely determined in the first few seconds. This was the reality of most actual gunfighter encounters in the post-war West. The mythology of the deliberate draw and the steady aim was constructed afterward, partly by the participants themselves, and partly by the newspaper and dime novel culture that needed the West to be something more dramatic than what it actually was. The cattle drives that created the cowboy culture of the 1870s and 1880s were conducted by men who were, by and large, veterans of the Civil War or the sons of veterans, and who carried weapons that reflected the surplus and commercial market of the post-war period. The Texas Longhorn cattle that were driven north to railheads in Kansas were guarded by drovers carrying Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers, weapons that were used far more often against coyotes and rattlesnakes than against other human beings. The violence of the cattle drive era, which was real but considerably more limited than the mythology suggests, was typically a violence of boredom, alcohol, and commercial dispute rather than the theatrical gunfighter encounters that the dime novel industry preferred. The economic history of the post-war firearms market is a thread of this story that the popular mythology almost entirely ignores. The transition from black powder to smokeless powder cartridges, from percussion ignition to centerfire metallic cartridges, from single shot to repeating actions, from military surplus to commercially manufactured weapons, represented a continuous commercial development that was driven by the competitive pressures of a market that had been created and educated by the Civil War. Samuel Colt had died in 1862 before the war ended, but the company he founded was the primary commercial beneficiary of the synthesis between military surplus culture and frontier demand. Winchester, operating from the platform of the Henry Rifle and its New Haven Arms Company predecessor, built the repeating rifle market that the Civil War had demonstrated was commercially viable. The companies that made the weapons of the frontier West were businesses responding to a market that the Civil War had created, and the weapons they produced reflected a continuous feedback between military development and civilian demand that the official separation between military and civilian culture tends to obscure. Oliver Winchester was not a gunsmith. He was a shirt manufacturer who had invested in the New Haven Arms Company as a financial speculation and found himself, by virtue of the war and its aftermath, presiding over one of the most consequential firearms manufacturers in American history. The gun that won the West was made by a man who made shirts. The mythology of the Western gunfighter that developed in the decades following the Civil War was not simply an embellishment of reality, it was a cultural construction that served specific purposes for a society working through the trauma of the war and the moral complexity of the frontier's actual history. The fantasy of the lone gunfighter with a Colt revolver, dispensing justice in a lawless land, was partly a way of narrating the post-war West as a story of individual heroism and moral clarity, rather than as the story of systematic dispossession, racial violence, and economic exploitation that the historical record documents. The weapons were real. The skill of the men who carried them was often real. The moral clarity that the mythology attached to their use was not. The surplus weapons of the Civil War did not create the violence of the post-war West. They armed a violence that was already embedded in the economic and racial structure of the expansion of American settlement into territory occupied by other peoples. The Spencer carbines that Lakota warriors carried at the Battle of the Little Bighorn were the same weapons that had helped end the Confederacy. The Colt revolvers that cattle drovers and sheriffs and outlaw bands carried through the 1870s and 80s were the direct descendants of weapons made for men who had killed each other in the same fields of Virginia and Tennessee a decade before. Even the weapons traveled west carrying the war's particular combination of technical capability and moral ambiguity with them. The last of the Civil War surplus weapons were still in use on the frontier into the 1890s, by which point they had been supplemented and in most cases superseded by the refined commercial products of the post-war firearms industry. By 1890, the frontier that those weapons had helped to define was officially closed, in the language of the Census Bureau, if not in any lived reality. The weapons outlasted the frontier. Many of them outlasted the men who carried them. Some of them are in museums. Some of them are in private collections. Some of them are still in the original configuration in which a Union soldier carried them at Gettysburg, or a Lakota warrior carried them at the Little Bighorn. Yet the history they carry is not the history of the mythology. It is the history of what actually happened when the most destructive war in American history ended, and the weapons it had produced flooded into a landscape where the legal and moral rules for their use were still being written. That history is more complicated, more consequential, and more honest about what the frontier West actually was than the story the mythology tells. It is also, if you are willing to follow where the evidence leads, considerably more interesting. The guns that won the West did not win it cleanly. They won it the way wars are always won, through the application of technological advantage to specific human beings in specific places for specific economic and political purposes that the mythology prefers not to name directly. The weapons are still there to be examined. The history they document is still waiting for a reading that does not require the mythology to remain intact.